Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Yarett for her presentation. Thanks very much.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Yarett. Nice to meet you all, and I'm delighted to be here. My sign name is Yarett, and I come from Puerto Rico, which is part of the Caribbean. Before I start, I'll give you an idea of who I am. So I was born in the south of Puerto Rico. You can see the red color marked there. And we signed that Ponce. So that's where I was born. All of my family are hearing. I was the only deaf person in the family. So just one of me. I was born profoundly deaf. So at the time when I was born, we had 3 deaf schools. One in the south, in Ponce, one in the north, San Juan, one in the east. And my family decided that we would stay in Ponce, but they didn't want me to go to the deaf school. So I was mainstreamed in both private and public schools. At that time, there were no interpreters within school, within the education system. So what that meant was that we used total communication, as it was called. Mum taught me speech and also had some signs. And if you remember, Puerto Rico is not an independent country, but it's a territory of the United States of America. I mean, I'll explain that in greater depth in a little while. So Mum decided to teach me using some signs, and she wasn't sure which sign language to use. So first, the sign language that she used was ASL, American Sign Language. She used a book. Obviously, because we're a territory of the US, there were resources for American Sign Language that she could access and use to kind of train herself. Then after I was mainstreamed in a hearing school, she wanted to make sure that I socialized with deaf people, so I would know my deaf culture. And she very much encouraged me to do that. So we have 2 languages, PRSL, Puerto Rico Sign Language, and ASL, American Sign Language. And I was socialized in both of those. When I graduated, I studied for a BA in industrial microbiology. And that was at the University of Puerto Rico. And that's Mayaguez campus. Then for my MA, I did educational neuroscience. And that was at San Juan. I had some experience of working within universities. And now I'm the president of the Advanced Sign Language Education and Services Corporation, ASLES. So it's a deaf-owned business. And this is the sign that we use. So let me give you some more information about Puerto Rico. Some people think that we just use American Sign Language, but it's important for us to delve into a little bit of the history of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico to better understand the linguistic landscape. Puerto Rico was first colonized by the Spanish. And there were deaf people there, obviously, at that time. And we don't have any historical documentation of the language that was used, but we know there were deaf people on the island during the Spanish occupation. In 1898, the US then occupied Puerto Rico. Mainly that's because the Spanish lost the war. So they gifted Puerto Rico to the United States. And at that moment, we started the transition in languages that were being used. In 1952, we officially said that Puerto Rico should use spoken English, but the Puerto Rican people refused to accept that English language dominance. And that's true to this day. People still speak Spanish in Puerto Rico. But there are different situations in government representation where it will be accepted that English and Spanish can both be spoken in those official environments. I'll also explain how that influenced the education system, but at this moment it's important just to acknowledge that the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico is a territory of the USA, and so that has influenced Puerto Rico in many ways, and of course brought the influence of American Sign Language. ASL is a big world language with many resources attached to it. And so it's easier for people to access and learn that language. And that's quite sad because PRSL is a language which is in decline, sadly, at the moment. And we're really trying to make sure that we document it well. Okay, so that probably gives you a little bit of an understanding of the history. I mean, many of you may be thinking, you know, oh, you know where Jamaica is potentially, but if you look at the map, you can see Jamaica's here, where the red square is. And this second square is where Puerto Rico is. And then finally, Trinidad and Tobago. So it's interesting because each island uses a different language. And as Ian has already said in his presentation, many people think that all of the Caribbean islands just use American Sign Language. And that's just a huge misconception. We have different histories, different influences, different education systems, all of which have different effects on the languages that we use. And so one of the areas that I'm interested in is how the education system influences language acquisition. So firstly, it's important to know the geographies of where these islands are. And then let's think about the data that we've got. We know it's very important that we have evidence. We need official numbers and data. And that helps our case. Okay, so on the islands, we do a comparison of the three islands. We have different curriculum which are adapted to deaf children. At the moment, we don't have a specific curriculum in any of the islands for deaf children. There is a national law on deaf education only in Puerto Rico. Jamaica has deaf schools, even though it doesn't have a national law on deaf education. And they have 9 deaf schools currently, which is great. Previously in Jamaica, we saw mainstream schools, and now we don't see that anymore. The government now prefers to make sure that deaf students and deaf children go to a deaf school specifically. Some of those schools have private financial support. There are private mainstreaming institutions, but most deaf students, children or young adults go to deaf schools in Jamaica. In Puerto Rico, we do have a national law on deaf education, but we don't have a specific curriculum adapted for deaf children. And again, that was quite shocking for me, really, because the USA has a curriculum, but that obviously hasn't been transported or brought to Puerto Rico. But one of the benefits of being under the USA is that we do have a national law which supports the education of deaf children. And I'll expand on that a little bit later to explain what that means. So how, as a US territory, their education system affects Puerto Rico. We have 3 deaf schools in Puerto Rico. As I said, one in the north, one in the south, and one in the east. 2 are private schools, and they are primary and secondary. The one in the south is only a primary school. We also have mainstreaming in Puerto Rico. In Trinidad and Tobago, it's interesting because similar to all of the islands, there's no curriculum specifically adapted for deaf children. Again, they don't have a national law on deaf education. But they do have 3 deaf schools. But those deaf schools are only primary provision, not for secondary education. And as with Puerto Rico, in the south, where that's only primary provision. So it's a deaf school, and then the students transition into mainstreaming. So the next question is, how many students are we talking about in the school population? And this is the data that we have. In Jamaica, we have deaf students in deaf schools between 450 and 500 students. In Puerto Rico, we have separate figures for mainstream students, which is around 413. And then in deaf schools, around 138 children of school age. And then in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a total of 100 students who are mainstreamed or who are in primary, so about 100. One of the things I was interested in finding information about was how well the teachers were able to meet the needs of the children, how qualified they were, whether they had sign language fluency. And so again, let's look at a breakdown of the different islands. Jamaica doesn't have a specific university degree in deaf education. You can't take that as a major. But the teachers are fairly fluent in sign language. They use assistants called DCFs, and that means deaf community assistants, facilitators. So that means in the classroom, you'll have 2 people, the teacher, and then the assistant who's deaf. And they support each other to deliver the curriculum to the children. And that's great because it means the children have a role model in the classroom. They can see that there's a deaf person there. They can acquire a language fluently from a strong language role model. And yet, the government doesn't necessarily officially recognize that language, but I'll come on to that point later. In Puerto Rico, we do have a university degree in deaf education, and that started, the university started offering that in 2000, in the year 2007. That course has developed reasonably well, but one of the problems with that degree is that it doesn't include sign language. There's one basic class for signing. And the reason for that is that the philosophy of the government department is that children should be oral and using speech and residual hearing rather than use sign language. But that seems, legally, there seems to be a different picture, but again, I'll talk about that later. So in terms of the teachers in Puerto Rico, you have teachers who are wanting to become more fluent in sign language, but maybe only a few who actually are fluent in sign language. So some teachers in Puerto Rico are fluent users of the language, but really it's a mixed picture. There are many who aren't, don't have good levels of proficiency. In terms of Trinidad and Tobago, again, there's no degree in deaf education. And of course, that affects the fluency of the teachers. To be clear, most teachers are hearing. So we see very few deaf teachers within the education system. So now you have an idea of the situation of the education of the deaf. It's worth us just considering deaf education, the history of deaf education. Ian has given some examples, and I want to expand on that so we can think about how deaf education started and how we ended up with the picture that has been described. So in this PowerPoint, a woman wrote a letter to the UK, to Britain, looking for help to develop deaf education. And one man, Reverend Gilbert, volunteered to come to Jamaica and support the development of deaf education. So he helped to establish a deaf school. First, Reverend Gilbert used BSL, British Sign Language. But then later, we can see, have we got the new slide now? Hopefully. Yeah, okay. Later, it seemed that more and more teachers came to Jamaica to help, but they didn't think that sign language should be used. They thought it would be better to use the oral teaching method, so English, lip reading, etc. So Reverend Gilbert seemed to adopt that teaching methodology. And this is what the principal for the Jamaica School said: we discourage sign language. Our aim is to give them language by encouraging them to look at the formation of words in lips, mouth, and tongue. So initially, deaf education, we had BSL, then we transitioned to the oral method.
As we move along the years, again, this is in Jamaica. This is the school, and it was an oral school. In 1975, you can see a woman in this picture. She arrived in Jamaica and she used English. Oh, sorry. She was in Trinidad and Tobago, not in Jamaica. She went to Trinidad and Tobago. the Reverend we spoke about also went to Trinidad and Tobago at some point. This woman here, when she was in Trinidad and Tobago with the Reverend as well, they both started to use English and again follow this oral teaching method and speech therapy and all of this. And she had the influence of bringing ASL to Trinidad and Tobago. So at that point in time, this school used an oral method combined with signed exact English. This is the Cascade School for the Deaf in 1949, the picture you can see on the screen now. That Ian mentioned in his presentation, it's their school. If you see this picture, this is again showing you in Trinidad and Tobago how they implemented this oral teaching method. The teacher would have a microphone and they would have an FM type system and they would have the headphones on and do their writing that way. And it's obviously a very difficult process to use to acquire information and learning, but you can see that in the picture. Moving on, this is in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico here, San Juan, this school has a really interesting history. Looking at before the colonization that America had of Puerto Rico, it was occupied by the Spanish in 1898. They were, these women here you see in the pictures, they were nuns from the US. And they arrived by ship into Puerto Rico and they wanted to help the deaf children. They started using a system of communication that integrated spoken language as well as facial expressions and signs. American Sign Language became official by the government in 1960. But before that, there was no official ASL, it wasn't an official language. So these nuns, they were missionaries. They were from Sacred Heart and they used English and facial expressions and signing to communicate and instruct the deaf children there. The first deaf school in Puerto Rico is in the West. As the numbers of pupils in the school grew, it moved to a new site in San Juan in the north of the country. Until 1956 about, at which point the nuns decided to leave Puerto Rico and they left the school and returned to the US. And so as obviously the colonization of America happened and it being a territory, the things started changing then. The nuns from Spain, so they gifted the school and left it to the nuns from Spain. And you can see here, they again instituted an oral method of communication. So we have the headphones, the FM systems, and no sign language use in the school. And this method of learning did affect the deaf children, as Ian has described before. If the children were signing or caught signing, they would be punished. They would be hit on the hand. And, this happened to me as well when I was at deaf school as well. It still happened and they would hit them on the hand and try and suppress them. So that's obviously really difficult for deaf children in the education system to go through such a punitive method. Now, when we're looking at mainstream schools, and we consider, is this the same, does the same language deprivation happen in that environment? The answer is yes. In the Caribbean, we do have language deprivation. Parents often think, oh, I have a child, I'm going to put them through a deaf school with signing, probably not. It's best that they go through an oral method of communication and education. They need to lip read. I'm going to put them in a mainstream school. The mainstream school is where they need to be. The parents often believe that the children do not need to learn sign language, and they think, oh, put them in a mainstream school and they'll learn to lip read and speak, and that will be fine. And so often what happens is that the children will fall behind. They don't have ways to communicate. They don't have sign language. Lip reading is very difficult. They were using their residual hearing. It can be very complicated. Teachers are speaking directly at them, or there's no sign language, there's no visual communication. And so we're looking at how will a mainstream school work for a student like that? And so we do see language deprivation in that environment. As we explained before, in Jamaica and in Trinidad and Tobago, there are no laws guaranteeing or providing for the education of deaf children. Puerto Rico does have such a law. Well, we actually have two very important ones. Well, three actually. The first and primary one is the ADA, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's from the federal government in the United States. That law then obviously is passed into Puerto Rico and is implemented here. It needs to apply to schools as well in Puerto Rico. There's a 1973 law as well. It's in 1973, this is an American law that was passed. It's called SENDA. It's not a Puerto Rican law, it's an American law. And this was a law for people with disabilities in general, but it specifically mentions and includes deaf people. So these laws are established in the United States. They are then implemented, well, they are then enforced in Puerto Rico, or supposed to be, but what we see in reality on the ground is that they are not. There's no compliance. So the US has specific curriculums, and they have assistants, they have all of these materials and resources, and these materials are available in the United States, but when you see it on the ground in Puerto Rico, we don't have that. We do not have those materials. We do not have the compliance to these laws. America has larger budgets. Puerto Rico faces budget cuts all the time. And so that really does affect the education of deaf children. We need more teachers in Puerto Rico who are proficient in sign language. We need assistants that can be, the teaching assistants have very basic sign language in Puerto Rico. We need to improve in that area. Most of the assistants that we see in the school environment also don't know deaf culture. They don't know how to interact and engage with deaf pupils. When we're looking at the interpreting situation, there's often not a huge amount of education that's provided to them. They might know some basic information about basic math and everything. The whole point is that when we're comparing Puerto Rico and America, Puerto Rico is far behind in both mainstream and the deaf school education. So there was a law in so we have the law 173, which was passed in 2018, and that does include deaf children in mainstream education. And what this says is that deaf children and deaf students are allowed to decide what language they will communicate in. So if the deaf children say, oh, I want to communicate in spoken English and use an oral method, the educators have to respect that. If a deaf child decides that they want to communicate in sign language, that has to be respected. And you have to support them and search for the resources to implement that in their education. The question is, do we actually see this actually happening in practice in these school environments? No, we do not. Still, deaf children that are signing they're really struggling. They're struggling to get acceptance of their choice and of their sign language, and to have that be their primary method of communication and education. When we look at Puerto Rico, the teachers and the people in control and in power think that ASL is the language that is most important and is the one that should be used. But the truth is, in Puerto Rico, the deaf community is not using exclusively ASL in their everyday communication. They're using Puerto Rican Sign Language. The law that we were talking about in 2018, it doesn't specifically say which sign language they can be instructed in if they choose sign language. So it's very confusing which language should be the level of instruction. So we have the words and we have the laws, but how they apply in practice, they're not providing for communication. It's not working. It's not being implemented well. Suppose someone wants to go to university. It's impossible. With the interpreting situation that we have, the interpreters come in and they're largely unintelligible. And they can't keep up with the complexity. Their training isn't as advanced to keep up with university level information. When we look at the support services for deaf children, schools are required to provide sign language interpreters. They're required to provide, as you can see on the screen, we're going to talk about all of the different support services. So they're required to provide sign language interpreters, note takers, the CART, so live captioning from spoken into written English or whatever. And then we also have the FM systems with the radio microphones. The Department of Education must provide those to support. In addition, they must provide hearing aids, and they also must provide devices that are compatible with those hearing aids. Now, when we look about putting an interpreter into a situation like this, often, most times, the interpreters are not fully qualified. They don't necessarily have the ability to interpret educational content. They have a questionable background in deaf culture and what they've learned about this. In Puerto Rico, we have a board of directors for this profession, and there are a lot of complexities, especially in regards to sign language acquisition in the field. So what are the biggest challenges for deaf education in our current time in 2023? The Department of Education in Puerto Rico has said, we use total communication. We offer this to deaf children as an opportunity for them to use sign language as their first language. But then we begs the question, which sign language? The government hasn't yet accepted Puerto Rican Sign Language as our national sign language or any other language in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico we don't yet have the linguistic documentation or research set up for this. So the government still thinks, oh, Puerto Rico uses the same as whatever America's using. Puerto Rican deaf people use ASL, and that affects our education system. We need to explicitly say which sign language we need and have the resources and materials available for that. We need to have the teachers educated on how to educate deaf children in that language. The Department of Education in Puerto Rico focuses on preparing and instructing children for their future work, for their future careers. But they don't say anything about these children getting ready for university. They omit that. They say they're getting them ready to go into their working life. It says preparing these students to go into employment, but it does not say prepare these students to go into university. Essentially, Puerto Rico does not have equal opportunity and equal access for deaf children to attend university and to succeed to their fullest potential and have a real full and fulfilling career. So when we're looking at Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, and Puerto Rico, and all of the islands of the Caribbean, we have quite a few barriers to education that are faced by deaf children. Deaf children and hearing teachers do not have the opportunities to learn country sign, JSL, Jamaican Sign Language, TTSL, Puerto Rican Sign Language, or to know deaf culture and to develop in that way. Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, and Puerto Rico the government has not yet known or accepted are sign languages as official languages. It hasn't happened yet. They haven't accepted this. Until they accept and respect that, there's no way to be inclusive. There's no way to push these things forward. We don't have a curriculum that meets the needs of deaf children. Teachers and assistants do not have the skills and qualifications and proficiencies in sign language. And certainly not in a level that can provide a quality education to the children that they're instructing for them to become successful and achieve their potentials. Deaf children experience far more bullying, far less self-acceptance. They're often non-attending at school. They have a poor social life. Their academic advancement is poor. And their language acquisition is much slower. Their literacy levels are slower. They're falling far behind their hearing peers. So I've given you all of this information. And essentially we need to be looking at and researching deaf education from a cultural perspective. We need to be bringing equitable information and education to the deaf children in all of these different nations. Sign languages must be practiced and must be provided in Puerto Rico. We need to have people with proficiencies in these for these things to be successful. We need the laws to be implemented, and not just there, they need to actually be implemented in the country. When we look at Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Tobago, we need to be looking at the moment, they're all using curriculums from these children's hearing counterparts and just placing them on deaf children without any consideration of how a curriculum needs to be tailored to the needs of deaf children. We need materials and resources that match the needs of children in deaf education. And this obviously also affects the teaching that they're receiving. There are few deaf role models for these children to look up to. We need to provide more opportunities, more models, more people, more deaf people, more adult teachers for these children to look up to and see themselves as adults and be able to aspire to. That's it for my presentation.
So the questions from before, I will hang fire with them and put them in the question and answer session. But if you do have any questions specifically regarding Yarett's presentation, and maybe now we have a little time for some for some questions in particular. So yeah, we could put them in the chat, or again the same process as we did earlier. So there's a question from Sandra. Sandra says, do you have teachers of the deaf training courses in Jamaica at all? Is that right?
Yes, we do have TOD training and for teachers assistants. But the question then is, which sign language? So the other question is, which resources are used in the training? And that obviously affects the education as well. So that's one of the problems we have in Jamaica. I think that's also happened in Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago as well. Governments may accept the deaf community, but they may not be mindful of the languages that are used, and then they're not clear on which languages they can use in education. So we need to make sure that that perspective and the cultural perspective is kind of taught well to governments.
Sandra just responded and has said teachers of the deaf courses, they'll include how deaf children are educated and how they're educated well, meaningful and accessible assessments too. So yeah, thank you, Sandra. Other questions from Kevin Buckley. His question is, with regards to Puerto Rico, are there coders there that have become interpreters?
Yeah, we have coder interpreters in Puerto Rico. some of those have formal training, some of them don't. Some coders use ASL, and that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of PRSL users. Some only use PRSL and no ASL at all. So we're trying to establish a board to actually think about the languages that are being used and also to further PRSL. When we have interpreters on television, mostly the government pays for that, and so it's ASL interpreters. And that means that deaf people who are outside of the capital, outside of San Juan, won't necessarily understand the interpreters. So, for example, if we think about hurricanes, there was a big hurricane event in 2017, and the government had an interpreter for an emergency announcement for Hurricane Maria. But the problem was that some areas of the country didn't have access to the television, didn't have access to the internet. And so in those areas, they decided to actually go to the areas. If you met deaf people then there and asked whether they saw the television, they would say, yeah, I saw the television. And then when you ask, did you understand? You know that tomorrow the hurricane will impact tomorrow? They're like, oh no, tomorrow? I didn't know that. And they said, yes, you know, the event will happen tomorrow. So they weren't prepared. So even though they saw an interpreter on television, they didn't understand the information that was given to them because of the sign language that was used. So that's just one very small example of the complex situation of the different languages used on an everyday basis in Puerto Rico.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got 2 more questions in the chat. I will hold on to them and I'll pose them later for our Q&A session. So I think now it would be a good time for an eye break. I'm sure we all want more tea and coffee. So we will come back in 10 minutes at 11:55 for the 3rd presentation from Andre. Just to let you all know, it's very exciting because Andre has been waiting for his visa to return. And so we were hoping that Andre would get his visa, but what happened was that Andre actually received his visa yesterday. So he immediately booked a ticket to fly over, and he's on the plane and is in the process of landing and getting all of that sorted at the airport. So fortunately, he agreed to pre-record his presentation. And so that means that we do have his presentation and we have that ready to go to show you all. So I think he'll also be able to join us for the final question and answer session. So he'll be live for the end for the Q&A session. So we'll have a 10-minute break, return at 11:55, and then I'll see you then. So yeah, and thank you very much, Yarett, for your presentation. I really enjoyed that. It was very, very interesting. Thank you.